and see my slides, do shout if there's any issues. My name is Lucy Gaffney. I'm leading the development of this Business and Biodiversity platform. This is our very first members forum. We're hoping to do these on a quarterly basis. So we're delighted to have you here for the first members forum, and we hope that you will continue to engage with the platform as it grows and evolves. While we're waiting for the rest of the participants, I would encourage you to engage with our Menti survey that we just want to throw out a few questions to the audience. It's important for us to be able to measure our impact as well in terms of how the work that we're doing and how you're engaging with us. So Emer, when you're ready, you can pop the Menti up. So moving on, the next question, and it's a really difficult one to answer for a lot of people, is why is nature and biodiversity important for our economy, important for our businesses, important for our people and our well-being? A lot of work has been done on this, and I'm just going to start by defining. And the reason why I'm defining these terms is because they feature in a lot of the frameworks. And when we refer to nature, this is how it's defined throughout things like TNFD, CSRD, and all of the different alphabet soup of frameworks out there. So when we talk about nature, we're talking about the living and the non-living realms of nature. The living realms being biodiversity and all things obviously that are alive, and the non-living components, water, soil, and air, that we also depend on. And in many of these different frameworks, we nature can be understood through these four realms. We refer to these four realms of nature: ocean, land, fresh water, and atmosphere. And for anyone in the audience that's familiar with the science-based targets, they have specific land and freshwater targets. So you can just see how we're aligning that terminology. And an important point is that society and business and our economy, it both impacts and depends on each of these four natural realms. So just to kind of clarify, because it is language that you'll see cropping up in these frameworks and methods. Biodiversity then is referring to the diversity of all life on Earth, including the diversity and types of habitats and ecosystems that exist within our biomes, the diversity of species, so between species, but also within species. So we're talking about genetic diversity. And biodiversity is a key indicator of the health and intactness of an ecosystem, of a habitat. And so it's a very important thing to be able to measure. I want to introduce you to the concept of natural capital, if that's not a term you've heard of before. This diagram comes from the Natural Capital Protocol developed by the Capitals Coalition. And natural capital can be defined as the stock of renewables and non-renewable resources, so plants, animals, soils, that will combine to yield a flow of benefits to people. So it's basically nature's contribution to people. That's how we would define natural capital. And natural capital is a term that's kind of growing in the way people understand it, but it's an important term to sort of be familiar with because it does crop up in a lot of the legislation and regulation that has now come on stream. I want to introduce you to Nature Positive as well. Some of you, again, might be familiar with this. And I have kind of created this simplified diagram to help people understand how their business is connected to nature and how nature underpins all aspects of your business and your local economy and your national economy. So the idea of natural capital there and how we sort of harness it and harvest it through our primary sectors like extractives, mining and agriculture, and it's transformed into all of the stuff that we use on a day-to-day basis through those secondary sectors of manufacturing and production, into our clothes, into our tech, into our food, and then it goes into that tertiary system where we have services and retail and financing. And as you can see, the current model is very linear. And so if we continue to operate in that linear mode, it will be a finite system and eventually you're going to run out of stuff. So the idea behind investment in natural capital is finding ways to mobilize finance, so private sector finance, back into nature conservation and the stewardship and restoration of nature and protection of our natural capital so that we may continue to operate in the way that we're accustomed to. And so moving into these kind of circular models of operation, including the movement of finance as well. So Business for Nature is an organization with which we're aligned, and they define nature positive as actions and activities that are reducing the negative impacts of businesses, not just within their direct operation, but also within their value chain, and also an effort to redirect financial investments towards the protection and stewardship of nature. I also like to conflate net zero and nature positive and make that really strong point that there is no net zero. It's a fantasy if we have degraded nature's capacity to deal with our carbon emissions and to deal with all the excess phosphorus and nitrates in the system, in the environment. We need nature. We need nature's capacity to deal with this. We need the infrastructure. And so we absolutely cannot achieve net zero without investment in nature and without operating in a nature positive way. The World Economic Forum came out in 2021 and said, the mantra should be, we'll do less harm or do no significant harm, reduce our impact and tread lightly. But the nature positive movement goes beyond that. It's going beyond just we're not doing any harm. It's moving into the realms of actually our economic activities enhance biodiversity and support ecosystems. So how can we change our business models to reflect that rather than the status quo of we're not doing any harm or minimizing our harm? So it also feeds into the Sustainable Development Goals, and all of these things are connected, and it's important to understand those connections. When we look at net zero and nature positive, I thought this was a really nice slide that I saw at a recent summit back in October, and it sort of aligns the guidelines with the net zero agenda and the nature agenda. So we have these global objectives, limiting global warming to 1.5, and in the nature positive space, it's the global goal for nature, which I've already mentioned. We have the frameworks. We've got Paris and the Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Business level targets are about hitting net zero or being climate neutral, which we're not allowed to say anymore, by the way, versus biodiversity, which is more complex, and it's a basket of local targets specific to your sector, specific to your geography, and it's adapted to material impacts, dependencies, risks, and opportunities. Business level commitments on the climate side are net zero by 2050, and on the nature side is contribution to a nature positive economy. And it's a little bit more vague, but it's important to note that no one sector or no one organization can be nature positive on its own. We all have to transition together towards a future that is nature positive, because if you're doing the best that you can, but your suppliers aren't, and you're engaging with them through your supply chain, then ultimately your business is contributing through the value chain. So it's important that we create an entire economy around nature positive. And then the scope of commitment, you'll be happy to know there's no scope 2 in the nature side of things, but in net zero, we obviously have the 1, 2, and 3 scopes, and in nature positive, we have scopes 1 and 3. So just to sort of see how those two things are aligned. We've done a great job of talking about climate and biodiversity separately, and I think, excuse me, one of the things that we need to do now is to bring those two conversations together, because they are essentially the same issue and should be and can be tackled together. So why should your business care about biodiversity loss? Well, your business has an impact on biodiversity. It might be through your direct operations, or it might be through a demand that you're placing for a product or commodity within your value chain. But somewhere in the world, nature degradation is happening, and industry drives that. We also depend a lot on the nature's contribution to people. So the ecosystem services that nature delivers that we don't necessarily value, but we absolutely depend on. So businesses and people are depending on those services that come from healthy ecosystems, and of course the stocks that, like food, fibers, excuse me, and materials and medicines that come from the natural world. Nature loss poses significant risks to businesses, including business continuity, supply risk, financial risk, insurance risks. In fact, the list of risks is growing. And as we start learning more about nature risk, and as we start seeing the implications of nature loss, we're starting to understand the risk profile more intimately. We also talk a lot about opportunities, and I think I can say with a degree of confidence that in this room we have a cohort of forward-thinking businesses, and that is why you're here. And you will be the businesses that will benefit the most from getting ahead of other organizations that are slow to adopt the nature agenda. You will get ahead because you'll be able to attract the right people into your business. Like, we need to understand that, people from the millennial generation and Gen Z have a very different viewpoint on environmental issues. And if you want to attract and retain them, you need to have a very strong environmental ethical agenda within your organization. So there's lots of opportunities there for business. I'll talk briefly on the impacts on nature that businesses drive. So these 5 impacts on nature have come from the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, that's IPBES. In 2019, they declared these 5 main drivers of biodiversity loss, and businesses pressurize these drivers. So businesses generate pollution through waste. They facilitate or perpetuate the movement of invasive species, which have both economic and ecological impacts. The way that we manage our land or change the use of our land, and you can see this photo on the right-hand side from the Borneo project, and that very clear delineation between the natural primary forest, so the biodiversity-rich natural rainforest, and these sort of rows of regimented palm trees that were planted there after the destruction of that primary forest. So you can see even from this eagle view that there's a great difference in the diversity of that, even within that picture. Climate change is a huge driver of biodiversity loss, and biodiversity loss also drives climate change. They're so interconnected. And we also need to understand how our business directly exploits natural resources and what impact that has on the natural world. So these are just examples of how businesses can impact. So emissions, land management, waste, and discharges to soil. You can see the different noise and disturbances. And if we want to talk about dependencies, well, look, there's a picture of Middleton there from October last year, absolutely destroyed from flooding. And, that is in part due to how the land around that catchment was managed or mismanaged, I guess, in terms of water and the river management side of things. And it could have been a lot worse, we're hearing now, if the tide had been in. But there's a lot of opportunity there to incorporate nature-based solutions and natural flood management into this area to improve the situation for the residents of Middleton. But you can see here these ecosystem services are listed there from, this comes from WWF 2016. I reckon there's more ecosystem services that have been defined since, but this just gives you a very nice idea of exactly what we're receiving from nature, what nature is contributing to us as a species. And they're quick examples of direct business dependencies. So pollination in some cases, access to clean water, raw materials. So I know this is my last slide. So what is central to the work that we're doing here is this diagram. And this is called the Act D framework. And basically what it is a representation of the logic that exists within those frameworks that are currently out there, like TNFD, like the Natural Capital Protocol, and even like CSRD. This is all very aligned, and this is the logic that it follows. Assess your impacts and dependencies on nature, know the risks, and developing a meaningful biodiversity strategy around that information. So we're moving away from arbitrary biodiversity strategies involving tree planting and wildflower meadows. We're moving towards that strategic biodiversity strategy. And then setting commitments, so developing a clear strategy with clear objectives, aligning to something like the science-based targets, and ultimately transforming the way you do business. So evolving your business model, all within an environment of transparency and disclosure.